A dialogue centre takes parliamentarians out of Parliament. If there's an issue which clearly is going to affect people, say, in subsistence farming, our role is to make sure those members of Parliament go out, understand fully what those subsistence farmers are experiencing, what will actually help them, and have a proper dialogue with people who are going to be affected in that particular sector. Code of principles are that dialogue centres are neutral, they're non-partisan, so they don't serve any political party, they serve a parliament as a whole. They are also inclusive of all economic sectors, so they will provide services and support micro businesses to multinationals. So they operate under what is called Chatham House rules, which encourages openness, but also confidentiality where there is sort of commercial considerations at stake. They provide a forum which operates according to the code of principles that I've mentioned, and the dialogue that takes place is facilitated in a way that everybody feels and is getting a benefit out of it. In most countries that we work, there's generally contempt for their parliamentarians and their politicians, who people see as just looking after their own businesses. And business people, particularly those in small enterprises and the rural economy, feel they don't actually get the support that's needed. We have a unit, which is a dialogue centre, which helps with this problem. Parliaments aren't corporate bodies. If you go into a company and you become a manager, the company will make sure that you're equipped with the competencies, the skills and the experience to do that job. If you're a doctor, it takes about 5 years for you to become a doctor. To be elected takes usually, in most countries, about 6 weeks. And you're expected to make decisions affecting society and the economy, often with very little knowledge. We have to deal with people who often have special interests, often have specific interests in advancing a policy or want to advance their particular businesses. What we're good at is finding a way of getting them engaged in a process where they do gain something, not necessarily a financial interest, but they do gain, and they see that there is a different approach in which they gain. Most parliaments are at the most 300 or 400. So you have to put a lot of effort into making sure that you are getting everybody on board. It's almost a form of conflict resolution. I worked in Northern Ireland where you did have assembly members who'd been killing one another. And the art is in finding, okay, what is going to answer their agenda which is legitimate. The economy has no political baggage. And actually, an improved economy, everybody is going to benefit from. You find in a lot of countries where there are business people who clearly are a special interest, they actually would prefer not to be. There are a lot of disadvantages to it. You can advance your company for a while, but almost any business will flourish and do better if it's in a properly regulated, transparent market where there isn't deep corruption. Because I guess it does what its name implies, the only way you're going to get answers to those sort of issues are by engaging all the stakeholders to arrive at answers that are going to be reasonable for the broader population and not a special interest. Dialogue centres are very good at facilitating that dialogue and those sort of outcomes. When we worked in Northern Ireland, during the peace process, the members of the 9 parties would not be seen in public together. And indeed they had been killing one another. But they were going to become members of an assembly. So they were going to have to deal with economic issues. The economy has no political view. So we could bring them together on the economy when they wouldn't be seen together publicly. And you can use the economy as a means of conflict resolution. We've worked in a number of conflict areas. And very quickly you find that people who've been shooting one another, actually their daily bread and butter, they both have a common interest in. And you change attitudes through a process, through giving them an experience. So, within a dialogue centre, if you said to us as a businessman, look, this aspect of the trade law is not just, it's the responsibility of the dialogue centre to actually make sure that's looked at. If it's your individual business, then we might have a problem with that. But if your issue is affecting a number of businesses, then a dialogue centre has a responsibility to make sure that it is looked at. Let me give you a classic example. In Ossetia in Georgia, because of the way the Georgian government felt that the Russian government had undue influence in Ossetia, you had a government in Ossetia, South Ossetia, which nobody recognized, and people grew things essentially, but all the trade was illegal, in the midst of which they often shot one another. If you had a program which legalized trade, if you looked at actually where all the parties had an interest in this product being successful, then very quickly people stopped shooting one another. And actually, because you'd made that trade legal, that also improved the situation enormously. And that's essentially what we did. Within the framework of a dialogue centre, where we had no agenda except to facilitate an answer to this economic need, you were reducing violence and conflict. And people found that actually that way was a bit more effective than killing one another and smuggling an illegal economic activity. Dialogue centres, because they are answering specific policy, legislative or regulatory issues, in that process can strengthen capacity considerably. More effective consultation with marginalised groups, particularly those who are in the rural economy, for example, micro businesses, capacity building of their parliaments, that they help parliamentary committees and individual members to work more effectively. And directly, because that's what they deal with on a day-to-day basis, more effective economic legislation that does actually help the economy and not special interests. Government has to see you not as a threat. That's absolutely crucial. And then people start to use you, because no government wants to produce bad legislation or bad regulation. I give an example. In Armenia, which is extremely corrupt, that there was a law which looked good on customs, an improved customs law. But then when you looked at it closely, there was a very peculiar provision. When we questioned it, the minister had insisted on this provision, and the reason he'd insisted was because if it was followed through, he'd make some money out of it. But at least through our process, people had picked up on that. I do know that with the tax code, that we did. It was a vastly better tax code, and at least everybody had a stake in its development. Good governance actually is rather essential for a normal economy. And I mean, African leaders are beginning to realize that there are things that they just can't do. If you look, 10, 15 years ago, people did things which now most African leaders would regard as completely unacceptable. There might still be corruption, and they may well do things that are not very good. But it has improved, hasn't it? And there does seem to be, amongst the general public, and I do think that information technology has got an awful lot to do with this. Our methodology, we've literally developed by doing it, and we're actively involved. Eastern European at the moment, Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, Mongolia, New Zealand, Spain, Sweden, Finland.